Star Wars 7x7 episode 3138. Today, it's the second half of my conversation with George Mann, author of The Battle of Jedha. Punch it! Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for joining me for it. So once again, the deal with George Mann. He is a Sunday Times best-selling novelist and scriptwriter. He's the creator of the Witchwood Supernatural Mystery series, as well as the popular Newberry and Hobbs and Tales of the Ghost series, two of which are in development as TV shows. He's written comics and novels and audio dramas for properties such as Star Wars, Doctor Who, Sherlock Holmes, Judge Dredd, and Dark Souls, and he's currently part of the writer's room on a forthcoming genre television show. Very cool. For our purposes today, though, we're going to pick up the conversation that began in yesterday's episode, and we're going to talk about how the Battle of Jedha is a linchpin story between Waves 1 and 2 of Phase 2 of the High Republic storytelling. We're going to talk about how Tales of Enlightenment, his short story series in Star Wars Insider magazine, plays into all of this, and about the journey of Keth that we met in Tales of Enlightenment, who continues his journey in the Battle of Jedha. We'll also talk about his proclivity, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, for the dark side, and about the Path of the Open Hand, the Brotherhood of the Ninth Door, and the Sith, and how they play in that space. This is a really awesome part of the conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did, and seemingly as George did as well. So without further ado, here is the second half of my conversation with George Mann, author of The Battle of Jedha.
So the Battle of Jedha has also been described in various places as a linchpin story connecting Wave 1 and Wave 2 of Phase 2. I'm wondering, like, is that how you see it as well? And as far as your place in between these waves, how does it affect your creative process, knowing that you have a lot of threads coming in from Wave 1 and a lot of threads that are going out to Wave 2? What is it like for your creative process in terms of connecting these two waves?
It makes it longer. Yeah, I mean, it was, I won't pretend, it was a challenge. It was a challenge this time because it wasn't a story I could tell in isolation. You know, for the Hidden City, because it was a book one, I was setting up something, writing these characters for the first time, inventing new characters, putting them into a situation. You know, you can just write the story.
Right.
With Battle of Jedha, it was very much, you know, picking up the threads from Quest of the Hidden City, picking up the threads from Path of Deceit, picking up the threads from Convergence, and then leaving all the characters where they needed to be for Lydia and, you know, for Cav in particular, but for Daniel as well. And, you know, there was lots of, like, we know a lot of characters are moving through this story. So again, that presents its own challenges in terms of plot armor and things like that, because, you know, although, you know, you might not know who's going to survive or not, I do, because I know who's writing what books next. So I know where I need to hand off these characters to. So, you know, there was a lot of planning, a lot of revision work, to be honest, because we were writing simultaneously. Whereas, you know, Zoraida was finishing her book, Cataclysm. No, it's the other way around, isn't it? Convergence, yeah. Yeah. She was finishing Convergence. I was already writing Battle of Jedha, and then we had to make sure they went, like, you know, they're laced together. And I spent a lot of time with Cav. Thankfully, as I say, you know, we're mates, so we're used to doing this, because he was writing the comic, obviously set on Jedha at the same time.
Yes.
So, you know, and I was also writing the short stories for Insider that were also set on Jedha at the same time. So we were really kind of planning, like, well, okay, there's a scene, I think people have seen it now, that where the Herald gives a speech, and it's the same in both. So it's kind of, Cav had a very clear idea of how he wanted that speech to work in the comic. So I initially left that scene. I just blank in the audio and carried on, because I knew what the output of it was going to be, but I didn't know that, you know. And I thought, well, if Cav's got a really clear idea, we should let him write that scene, and then I'll take it and put a different spin on it, see it from a different angle, but the text will be, of the speech will be the same.
Mm-hmm.
And we've worked really closely. I mean, obviously I can't give away spoilers because there's still stuff playing out in Marvel comics, but we worked really closely to make sure that everything was aligned. So people won't get the full picture of what happens on Jedha until they've read the comics as well.
Ah, gotcha.
And the rest of the insider stories as well. And there's a few more to come. And they cross over as well with, I mean, I think we'll probably talk about it. There's some crossover between them and the audio, but there's also crossover with what's going on in the Marvel comic as well. So a lot of planning and a fair amount of kind of like sketching in scenes that I knew were going to have that crossover so that I could then go back to them later and kind of do another pass and tighten them up and make sure that we were handing things over properly.
That's awesome. And you keep saying things that make me want to talk to you about Keth, and I'm
well, let's talk about Keth.
let's just do it, because so here in the US, Star Wars Insider 216 has dropped, so The Unusual Suspect is already out and available, and we've talked about it on the podcast already. The fact that Keth does not appear in there, and there's an initial discussion of like, Keth's usually here by now, so I guess this is the place where we'll put the spoiler warning for folks, because the audio drama has been out for over a month, so I think we're fair. But Keth does not make it out of the Battle of Jedha, and so when I read The Unusual Suspect and they're like, Keth's usually here by now, that happens very early on in the short story, and I was like, oh, like, just that you talk about pulling the heartstrings, and I was like, oh, Keth. And then it turns out that this story is actually happening during the Battle of Jedha, and Keth has not yet met his untimely demise necessarily. So he's still out there, and they don't know. Parali and Muna, they Creighton, they don't know that yet. So just it is kind of heartbreaking to be a reader, a listener living in that space, knowing that these characters don't know. And that's a credit to you, of course, because you've created such well-formed characters that you actually have these feelings for them in anticipation of their discovery of the events of the Battle of Jedha. So you got to bring those Tales of Enlightenment characters into the Battle of Jedha. Like, that was, I assume, part of your plan all along, or was that something where when you found out you were going to get to do this story, was it particularly exciting for you to say, I've been working on these characters, I'm so psyched I get to bring them in here?
I'm going to get this right in my head, the way around it all happened. So as part of the story architect stuff that Cav did for Jedha, he'd already created Enlightenment, Creighton, and the Twinkle Sisters.
Ah, okay.
So I knew they existed. So when I'd read through the documents and I was planning the Battle of Jedha, I was like, these guys have to be in Battle of Jedha. Of course, the bar's a linchpin of Jedha at the time, and we knew it was also going to be a point where the stories cross over. They're going to feature in the comics. They're going to feature in the Star Wars Insider stories. They're going to feature in the Battle of Jedha. So we kind of, if Enlightenment is kind of like this hub, where I kind of approached it, I knew I had this kind of, I was going to feature them in the audio, but I also knew that they weren't going to be main characters in the audio. They were going to be cameos. So I kind of was thinking to myself, what's the best way to have the bar keep coming back up? And it's like, well, we can have a regular. And it was around the same time I was starting to do that planning that I was approached to do the insider stories as well. And, unlike kind of phase one, we thought rather than do lots of different people writing stories, we'll do a series, serial fiction, essentially. Tales of Enlightenment. And I thought, well, okay, then we've got to make it like Cheers.
Yes.
We've got to have those people who are always in the bar. So I actually ended up writing the first Tales of Enlightenment before I wrote any scenes for Keth, Parali, and Muna in the audio. So I kind of fleshed them out. I started to flesh them out there. I did actually then have a chance to go back after writing some scenes to tinker with the first story before it went to press, just to make them line up. But it was actually something that Tom said to me, the Del Rey editor, was that Keth, when I kind of give him the outline, and he came back and he said, Keth is the only character whose story completes in this book. Because, like I said earlier, a lot of these characters are passing through. And, there are others. We said spoiler alert. So,
yes.
Tilson, people like that as well. But Keth's kind of one of the heroes, essentially. And we kind of went, well, his story has to be great then, because if he's going to die at the end of the story, we really have to kind of go into some depth into Keth and explore him properly, because it's in some ways it's his story,
right?
So that kind of gave me a lot of impetus to dig in and start fleshing those characters out a lot. And that's kind of when I added his droid companion, which I'm quite taken with the droid and the fact that it's got the vocoder that it can only speak in epithets and kind of stuff. So yeah, I thought, well, that's something I'm going to lean into as well. And now, I mean, I'm sad he died, really, because now there's still a few more insider stories to come, and those guys obviously at some point they're going to find out what's happened.
Right.
So we get the little epilogue at the end of the audio as well,
which is beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
If I may say,
I appreciate that. So there's we'll see a bit more of that sort of thing.
So how would you describe Keth's overall journey as a character through the stories, beginning as readers and listeners experience it with Tales of Enlightenment, because that's where we were first introduced to him, and then ending with the Battle of Jedha? How would you describe his overall story arc then?
One of fulfillment, I think, actually. Some characters have gone an arc of revelation, and some have gone an arc of redemption. I think for Keth, it's fulfillment. Excuse me, I'll just get rid of. There we go. Sorry, I was just getting rid of the pinging. I've forgotten to put it on silent. I apologize.
That's all right.
So yeah, so for Keth, I definitely think it's kind of about finding himself and the situations that he's always craved, and his place in the Force. He works for the Church of the Force. He's not the most pious person, but he craves something interesting happening, and he wants to be a part of something bigger, essentially, and that's what he's looking for, really, in his religion, his beliefs, and his life. He's got a happy life with a group of friends, people who care about him, but he goes to the church every day and he sweeps floors and runs errands, and then he's given this opportunity. And first of all, he thinks, goodness me, I've been given this opportunity, and it's babysitting some mediator guy, and But soon, obviously, he ends up partnering with Salandra, and I think he's a guy who he wants to be a Jedi. He can't be a Jedi. He doesn't have the Force. Doesn't have the ability to manipulate the Force. But he ends up kind of fulfilling that role, and that's why there's that kind of scene towards the end where when he is on his deathbed, and he's like, Salandra's like, you've been like a Padawan sort of thing, and because that's the role he ends up fulfilling. He helps, he saves lives. He does something very meaningful before he dies. In that he helps to evacuate people into the Dome of Deliverance, and helps Salandra, and helps her work out what's going on with the brothers of the Ninth Door and all of that. So I think I like to think that he gets what he's always wanted, even if it does come at a cost.
That's a beautiful answer. I like the idea of an arc of fulfillment. That's tremendous. You mentioned the Brothers of the Ninth Door, and I want to ask you about dark side stuff as well. You did an interview with a bunch of I think all of the new authors and story architects for Phase 2, and one of the questions that they asked in a rapid fire thing toward the end was about lightsaber color, and you chose red, and everybody seemed to be surprised by that, and you said that you had a hidden dark side. So I'd love to hear about whether you have any particular affinity for dark side users. I know Adam Christopher, who wrote Shadow of the Sith, also has said that he's particularly fascinated by the Sith. And so I'd love to hear your take on dark side, folks.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so it was half tongue in cheek, of course. I I'm not sure I do really have a hidden dark side, but I am fascinated with the dark side of the Force. I just think there's something really interesting, particularly when you decouple the dark side from the concept of evil. I think that's where it starts to get really interesting for me, because it's very easy for us to go, okay, dark side users are the bad guys in the Star Wars universe, but that's not necessarily the case, and it doesn't have to be the case. What dark side users are they're often fanatics, but they're also people who are operating from a place of fear, and that makes really interesting characters if you start to think about them in those terms, rather than I'm a cackling villain, wahahaha, I'm going to kill everyone. It becomes kind of, you start to think about people's motivations, like, well, what's drawn this person to the dark side? Why have they, is it that they're hungry for power, perhaps, or maybe it's because they're scared and they're looking for ways to defend themselves or protect their loved ones. And there's hints of what happens to Anakin in that you see how his arc develops. That's definitely where he's coming from. And I think what was interesting about creating the Brothers of the Ninth Door was to try and do a dark side sect that had different aspects to it. So while Mitian and the others who are working with him are clearly villainous, you also hear that there are Brothers of the Ninth Door out there helping people during the battle. So it's not entirely a black and white situation. It's not they're not on an axis of good guys and bad guys. They're on an axis of light and dark, and I find that fascinating. I think there's and everything in between, dark and light implies shadow. So where are they on that spectrum? Where are the Brothers of the Ninth Door on that spectrum? Maybe they're not as fallen as the Sith, and maybe they're not fallen at all. Maybe they're just exploring into the grey and the shadows, and starting to manipulate some of that force for what they believe is the right reasons. And we know that's a dangerous path.
It can be, certainly, and yet it seems like you're also of the mindset that perhaps people could be a few steps down that path, but decide that they're not going to take the additional steps that would drive them all the way to Sith levels of danger and destruction.
Exactly that. And it also means they don't necessarily turn around and say, I'm going all the way back to the light either. What does that mean then? What does that mean for that person? It doesn't mean they're a villain or a bad guy or evil, but they're not necessarily an out-and-out good guy either. So you've got, and that's kind of what I wanted to explore a bit with the Brothers of the Ninth Door, and particularly in the short story.
Yes.
Because that was kind of really looking at that as kind of everyone in the bar assumes he's a villain.
That's right. Yes. This is in the one that just came out, The Unusual Suspect, and Mindoku is, acts on behalf of Creighton and everybody in the bar to protect them against the gangs that come in. And it's either Parali or Mooney, I think it's Parali, who says like, why are you doing this? I don't understand it. And Mindoku has to say, why wouldn't I do it when people are in danger? And you can just assume that I was just acting selfishly and leave it at that, and let your own minds run about it. But I'm doing what needs to be done in my own particular way.
Yeah, exactly that. So and that's what's been so much fun about those short stories, that they've allowed me to focus on different aspects of some of the different kind of things that are going on Jedha. In a way that I couldn't with the audio, to explore that. There's the story where Keth has the conversation with the member of the Path of the Open Hand, and you get to see the philosophical reasons behind why they're like the way they are. And again, that was a huge amount of fun to write. So that's, I guess that's what attracts me to the dark side. I mean, everyone loves a great villain, of course they do as well. And and I do like writing Sith, and kind of those people who are, you know, just on that moral end of the spectrum. They're uncaring and they're selfish and they're only out for themselves. That's fun to write. Of course it is. But I guess doing Dark Legends, I've done quite a lot of kind of dark side and Sith stories, and with the Brothers of the Ninth Door, I wanted to do something a bit different.
So in terms of, say, the Convocation and the Festival of Balance, I guess I'll ask you for the three groups that we've mentioned here: the Brothers of the Ninth Door, the Path of the Open Hand, and the Sith. Do all three of those organizations, in your mind, belong as part of the Convocation or the Festival of Balance?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, really interesting question. I think the Brothers of the Ninth Door definitely do. I mean, we see, you know, Cavan has got the Sorcerers of Tund on there.
Yes.
So we see some of that representation already. I think the brothers should be on there, or certainly would have a place on there if, you know, in the future. The Path. I mean, I guess from a political point of view, having them on there means that you've always got the opposing voice, which is actually a useful tool for anyone in a position of power or governance, to hear the opposing voices and understand different perspectives. So I'd like to say yes if they could be believed. If the Mother really stood for what the Path supposedly stand for, then I'd say yes, without hesitation. But knowing the Mother as I do, as we learn through the stories that are developing in phase 2, yeah, maybe not. Sith, I think they're probably too far gone.
Yeah, I think they are beyond the pale, and I wonder if that means, as a result, that there is a group that would be ostensibly on the light side of the Force that exists that could also be considered too far gone on their end of the spectrum to not belong in the Convocation of the Festival of Balance.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely. You know, everything has its polar opposite. I mean, I suppose we're set up to believe that the Jedi and the Sith are opposites. I don't know if that's how true that is. Certainly, some Jedi have a slightly broader perspective. They're not so, you know, they're definitely not kind of on the fanatical end of things. Whereas I can imagine a fanatical light side, you know, sect being very dangerous. So yeah, that's an interesting question. That's you know, it poses something interesting for the Star Wars universe, doesn't it?
Well, I would certainly hope so. And I guess it's something we can pursue perhaps at a later date, and maybe later stories perhaps. But I know that you have things that you want to get to with your family in your evening, and I want to be respectful of your time and let you get to them. So before we go, I do just want to give you the opportunity to share where people can connect with you, whether your website, your social media, like where can people keep up with your journey ongoing, Star Wars and otherwise?
Yeah, thank you. So I've got a website, georgemann.net, all as one word. And then on socials, Twitter is at @George_Man. That's probably the best place to seek me out to start with. And then, like everyone else these days, I've got a Mastodon and a Hive, Instagram. I'm at George Mann Author on Instagram. So hit me on Instagram or Twitter, and then if you're on one of those other platforms, you can find out from links on there to find me on the other platforms. Yeah.
Terrific. And I will link to all of those in the show notes for this episode and in the blog post at sw7x7.com as well. George, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Again, congratulations on being a part of the High Republic and making such a tremendous splash with Battle of Jedha, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you very much for having me.
And there you go. That is my conversation with George Mann, author of The Battle of Jedha and numerous other Star Wars stories, and for other properties too. And that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it, as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
Wars 7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the force be with them. All original content is copyright 2021 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.